Why am I driving to my mom's house at nearly midnight in the pouring rain? Why are my husband and kids safe and dry at home, likely already sound asleep in their beds? And why did Jackson threaten to leave me? I haven't even done anything wrong. Or at least I don't think I have. What is going on? And why is everyone acting so strangely? My name is Emma Davis, though professionally, I go by my maiden name, Thompson. My husband, Jackson, never minded that. He knew how important my work as a clinical psychologist was to me, and that I'd earned my degrees and licenses under my original name. He supported me all the way, which is why we didn't marry until I was 26. That wedding day, nearly 10 years ago, was one of the happiest days of my life. We had a beautiful ceremony, not too big or too small, with all our family present. My dad, Tom, is quite the dancer. He's been taking lessons for around 15 years now, and that's actually how he met his wife, Nancy. Technically, she's my stepmom, but I was already 17 when they got together, so she wasn't really involved in raising me. My mom, Linda, was there too with her fourth husband, Carl. Getting everyone to come peacefully was a feat, but the night went off without a hitch. I even caught my mom chatting with Dad and Nancy as I danced with Jackson. Once Jackson and I married, we wanted to start our family right away. Now, we have 2 children, Olivia, who's 8, and Max, who's 6. A girl and a boy, 2 years apart, just like my younger brother, Ben, and me. They're home now, safe and sound, and I should be there with them. I don't even know why I'm out here, dealing with all this when I belong at home with my family. Jackson just needs to accept what's happening and move on. But he's so hurt and angry that I can't stay there tonight. I guess I should start from the beginning. Earlier this evening, I got home a bit early, arms full of groceries. I had everything I needed to make Jackson's favorite dinner, a meatloaf recipe from my mom, mashed potatoes, Brussels sprouts, and a good bottle of red wine. I even bought a key lime pie for dessert. I figured I'd make the night special before telling him about the conference I'd be attending next week, a trip he didn't know about yet. While the meatloaf baked, I cleaned up the table, set out the nice plates, and had time to shower, do my hair, and slip into a new blue dress that brings out my eyes. I even wore the necklace Jackson gave me for our 5th anniversary. Dinner was ready just in time for the kids to sit down, and I whipped up some mac and cheese for them since they won't touch Brussels sprouts. Jackson came in a little while later after picking up the kids, looking surprised by the fancy setup. I gave him a big smile, hoping he'd appreciate the effort. The kids were in high spirits and ate their dinner happily, even trying a bit of the pie, though Max didn't like the sour taste, so Olivia finished it for him. After we got the kids settled in front of a movie they've watched countless times, Jackson and I lingered in the dining room. He poured the last of the red wine for me and had a splash of his favorite scotch. He glanced at me, raising an eyebrow, and asked if there was a special reason for all the effort. I told him it was just a nice evening, though I hinted I'd need his help with something next week. When he asked what I needed, I finally told him about the conference I'd be attending in Chicago. I'd be gone from Tuesday through Friday, meaning he'd be handling the kids solo for a few days. I even teased him about making our weekend extra special before I left and promised an exciting reunion when I returned. But his reaction caught me off guard. His expression changed. He looked almost betrayed. "Why am I only hearing about this now, Emma?" he asked, sounding a bit hurt. I explained that the invitation had come up unexpectedly, and I hadn't had the chance to tell him yet. But he just shook his head, looking away with his jaw clenched. Jackson's frustration simmered as he quietly told me he wished I'd been more open with him. He said he needed a moment to think and asked me to put the kids to bed. He'd come up once he'd cleared his head, and with that, he turned away, leaving me there, wondering how my trip could cause such a divide between us. Jackson shook his head and walked upstairs, leaving me alone, feeling the weight of how differently the evening had gone than I'd hoped. For the next 20 minutes, he paced around the house, looking tense and restless. Every so often, he'd check his phone, reading something with a clenched jaw, muttering under his breath. At one point, he left a voicemail, saying, "It's Jackson. She's acting like Deborah right now. It's happening. So call me as soon as you get this." Deborah was my mom's name, but I couldn't understand why he'd bring her up now. What could she have to do with this? A few minutes later, his phone rang, and he stepped outside to answer it, giving me a cold, accusing glance on his way out. He clearly didn't want me to hear the conversation. When he came back, his phone rang again, and he quickly slipped outside once more. The kids noticed his odd behavior, though they didn't seem too troubled, more curious than anything. As their movie neared its end, Jackson vanished into the kitchen, where I soon heard the low buzz of the coffee grinder. Surprisingly, Olivia and Max were cooperative when it was time for bed. They brushed their teeth and changed into their pajamas without any fuss, sensing that something unusual was in the air. I felt just as unsettled, my nerves on edge. What could have him so riled up? Who was he talking to, and what did it have to do with my mother? With the kids tucked in, I headed downstairs and found Jackson back at the dining table, a fresh pot of coffee in front of him with 2 mugs and his large thermos. He looked up at me, motioned to a chair, and told me to sit. I took my seat, and he poured a mug of coffee for me, insisting I drink it even though I said it would keep me up. He stared at me intently, and I asked him, "Jackson, what's wrong? Why won't you just tell me?" His voice was calm but hard as he replied, saying I had nothing to worry about, emphasizing that it was just a conference, something he suggested I wanted to do for myself. I tried to reassure him, saying it really was just a short trip, but he pressed on, asking if I thought he was naive. I was stunned, telling him, of course, I didn't think he was stupid. He nodded, pausing, and then asked if I believed myself smarter because I had a master's in psychology. I assured him that I respected him deeply and would never look down on him. He leaned forward, saying he wanted nothing but the truth between us. No half-truths or evasion. He claimed to know more than I realized and warned that lying would only make things worse. I promised I wasn't lying, but he seemed unmoved, hinting that I might be lying to myself. He then asked when I'd first known about the conference, pressing me on whether I'd planned this whole evening to soften him up before telling him. I repeated that I'd only just been invited, and that was why I hadn't mentioned it sooner. He raised an eyebrow, saying nothing, and the silence was heavier than words. Then, he started his questions all over again. He asked who had invited me, and I said it was a colleague. He wanted specifics about the expenses, who was paying for the hotel, flights, and registration. I told him I'd be reimbursed later, but he wasn't satisfied, pressing for details about the costs. He even brought up our bank statements, suggesting I might have accounts he didn't know about. I assured him again that he had nothing to worry about, but his distrust was almost palpable. Then, he hit me with a question that made my stomach turn. Is Richard Allen going to be at this conference? For a second, my mind reeled, wondering how much Jackson knew or thought he knew. I admitted Richard would be presenting on Wednesday, and Jackson took out his phone, showing me the conference schedule, implying I would already know the details since Richard and I had worked closely together on past projects. I admitted that I knew but had overlooked it. Jackson let out a tired sigh and told me to cut the pretense, saying he wasn't a fool. My mind went blank. He recapped his suspicions. He believed that Richard, an older colleague who supposedly had feelings for me, had invited me on an all-expenses-paid romantic trip, and that I'd intentionally dropped this on him last minute. Jackson was certain I'd planned a cozy dinner to soften him up, then left him to handle everything at home to keep him from getting in the way. I firmly denied his accusations, reminding him that I'd been nothing but honest. But he just looked at me, repeating that he'd asked me not to lie to him or myself. Then he asked how long I'd been involved with Richard. My breath caught as I assured him there was nothing going on, but he pressed again, asking whether Richard was involved with anyone else or if I'd had any relationships outside of ours. Then, out of nowhere, he tossed in a random question about the capital of California, as if testing whether I was too rattled to think straight. My mind raced, but I held my ground, telling myself that Jackson couldn't possibly know anything because, of course, there was nothing to know. I kept telling myself that Jackson, my husband, needed to trust me, especially after all our years together. But he didn't seem to buy it. He leaned back, arms folded, and accused me of being too fogged up by an affair to see clearly. His eyes never left mine, searching for any sign of guilt. I denied any affair, but he countered, suggesting maybe nothing physical had happened. Yet, catching the shift in my expression, I explained that Richard had invited me to the conference about 6 weeks ago. I stressed that we'd have separate rooms and that I'd even cover my own costs, emphasizing how crucial this was for my career. I pleaded with Jackson to believe me, to remember how much I loved him and only him. Jackson took a long, slow sip of his black coffee, a symbolic jab at his preference for things undiluted and straightforward. He accused me of spoiling that honesty with secretive plans and deception. He said he wasn't sure of the details but felt sure I'd betrayed him. I took a deep breath, trying to reassure myself, insisting to him and myself that I'd done nothing wrong. Jackson shook his head, telling me I was setting myself up to be close to Richard, whether I meant to or not. Then, his gaze narrowed as he questioned the lingerie I'd bought earlier in the week, saying he'd seen the charge in our bank statement. I explained it was for him, for our weekend together and maybe for after I returned, but there wasn't much packed for the trip itself. He pressed further, asking if any of it was really for Richard. I froze, admitting that maybe I'd picked a few pieces thinking of my confidence at the conference, not about Richard specifically. But Jackson's face stayed hard, clearly unsatisfied with my explanation. He set his coffee cup down, the signal that this was more serious than I'd realized. He laid out his instructions calmly but firmly. I was to leave the house and stay at my mom's for the night. He insisted that I wasn't welcome to stay here and needed a wake-up call about how married women should act. He added that he'd already informed my dad, Robert, and his wife Nancy that I'd be coming over and that they were expecting me. When I tried to protest, calling the idea absurd and saying he had no right to send me away, he shot back that what was absurd was treating a conference like a romantic getaway and expecting him to accept it. Jackson reminded me that this wasn't the first time we'd had trust issues and warned that if I didn't get my act together, this marriage would be over. His voice was quiet, deadly serious. I argued that he couldn't control me, that he was my husband, not my boss. He shrugged, saying he couldn't force me to do anything but had every right to leave the marriage if he found my actions unacceptable. He made it clear that he would start divorce proceedings the next day if I didn't go along with his instructions, which included staying with my family for the night to give him space. Then, as if to put the final nail in the coffin, he assured me that my mom was already aware of everything. Just then, my phone rang. Jackson nodded for me to answer. It was my mom, and to my shock, she urged me to listen to Jackson, warning me not to make a choice I'd regret. She tried to calm me, mentioning that she was making cookies and that I should just head over. Before I could even respond, she hung up, leaving me even more rattled. As I processed everything, my phone buzzed again. It was my brother Ben, sending another text. He told me he was worried about the situation and offered to set up a spare room for me. He even joked about the new nursery setup in his house, saying I could sleep there if I needed it. When I didn't answer right away, he followed up, insisting that I come by, warning that if I didn't, he'd consider it a betrayal against Jackson. He added that he fully supported Jackson's side, mentioning some family curse, though I had no clue what he meant by that. Ben finished by saying he'd take everyone to IHOP the next day to clear the air. Still reeling, I looked at Jackson, questioning him about what he had told my family. He looked at me calmly, saying he'd only shared the truth and found their reactions helpful. He then told me to pack a bag, saying he'd make me a coffee to go. He added that he would handle things with the kids and update his family as needed. He assured me he'd wait to inform my dad, Robert, who would be devastated, until the situation was clearer. I took a quick swig of the coffee he'd made, now cooler with skim milk and extra sugar. With a heavy heart, I grabbed a large caramel latte for the road, stopped to get gas, and braced myself for a long, lonely drive to my family's home, questioning everything I thought I knew about my marriage and my family's strange role in this chaotic mess. I pulled into Mom's driveway at 10 minutes past midnight. As I arrived, the garage door opened, and I parked in the empty bay. Odd, Doug's car wasn't there. Mom greeted me at the door, saying how glad she was that I'd come and hinting that it wouldn't have been good if I hadn't. She welcomed me inside, mentioning there were cookies in the kitchen and offering me tea. At 60, Mom still looked elegant. She had kept her figure gracefully, despite the years showing in small ways. Her posture was impeccable, her dark hair streaked with gray yet still thick and stylish, and her eyes were as blue as ever, just like mine. I can only hope to look half as good at her age. She began pouring the tea, without me even asking, and I mentioned that I'd prefer no caffeine since Jackson had already insisted I drink both coffee and a double shot of espresso, leaving me jittery. Mom reassured me that it was chamomile and would help me relax. She gave me a once-over, noting that I was still wearing the same dress I'd had on when talking to Jackson earlier. I explained that he hadn't allowed me to change before sending me out. I barely had time to grab a few things and leave. Ben, who was there with Mom, looked uncomfortable and murmured, "Oh my." When I asked what was wrong with the dress, they exchanged glances, mentioning something about its significance and Ben's earlier comment about a curse. Confused and desperate for some clarity, I asked what they meant by that. Mom guided us to the sitting room, saying it would be easier to explain there. I noticed the TV was paused on a football game, which surprised me, as Mom usually avoided watching sports. I asked about Doug's whereabouts, and she explained that Doug was usually over at his friend Brian's house, a friend he'd been in a relationship with for nearly 20 years. Surprised, I asked her why she and Doug were even married, and she shared a complicated story about their arrangement. She said Doug identified as gay, though he never fully accepted that label, seeing his relationship with Brian as unique. She explained that, although Doug didn't feel shame, he hadn't embraced being openly gay. Their marriage was more of a friendship, an arrangement that had suited them given societal expectations. When I asked if she was involved in any outside relationships, she said no, and clarified that she wasn't gay. However, she admitted to being a challenging wife in her past relationships. With tear-filled eyes, she expressed how deeply she loved my father and regretted the pain she'd caused him. She looked at me, her expression soft, and told me she'd noticed the love between me and Jackson, urging me not to make the mistake she had. Overwhelmed, Mom excused herself and went to fetch something from one of the spare bedrooms. Left alone, I looked at the TV and noticed it wasn't a football game after all, but was paused on two middle-aged commentators who might have once been players themselves. Mom returned, holding a blue dress in a dry-cleaning bag. She said it wasn't the exact same dress I was wearing, but the length and color were nearly identical. She revealed that she'd worn this dress the night her marriage with Dad ended, almost 30 years ago. She wasn't sure why she kept it all these years, whether as a reminder of her mistakes or as a token of her time with Dad. She'd even worn it again this year on her birthday, but it had only made her feel worse. She recalled that it was a particularly cold Valentine's Day that year, during a snowy February, and her plans had been canceled, leaving her to spend the evening alone with her regrets. Mom sighed and continued, sharing stories of her old group of friends. They'd all seemed like pleasant couples, but the women had often schemed and gossiped together. One friend regularly bragged about cheating on her husband, and another was planning an affair with a coworker, with the group supporting her plan. "I never joined in that talk," she added quietly, "at least, not until one day I did." There was a well-known local athlete, a man who had a reputation for hanging around bars and clubs, specifically targeting married women. He took pleasure in seducing them, humiliating their husbands, and flaunting his power. He'd invite these women to his hotel, promising them an unforgettable experience that would leave them dissatisfied with any other man. He was charming, wealthy, and infamous, and so he got away with it again and again. His antics were an open secret among women looking for thrills, and he'd ruined more marriages than anyone could count. It was like a twisted game to him. One of his usual spots was a dance hall attached to a hotel, a place where couples could enjoy dinner and live music. My group of friends, some of whom were either cheating or considering it, decided to plan a night out there on Leap Day, February 29th. We invited our husbands, thinking it would help rekindle the romance. You and Ben stayed with the Porters, and each couple got a hotel room for the night. The men had no idea that bringing them along was like buying a raffle ticket, with one woman likely to be chosen by this infamous athlete, Mark Levier. At that moment, my eyes shifted to the television screen, where the commentator on the left side caught my attention. His name, Mark Levier, was displayed under his face, and I recognized him as Mom's notorious date. The shock hit me like a punch, leaving me dizzy and sick. Memories rushed back to me, blurred but unmistakable. I remembered vague moments of staying with my grandparents while Dad was mysteriously absent. I was only 6 years old, but even then, I'd sensed something was wrong. Mom continued, acknowledging that my father had tried to shield me from everything, though I likely wouldn't remember most of it. She shared that during that painful time, Dad had left for weeks, furious and devastated, finally returning to give their marriage another chance through counseling. But it had turned into a disaster. Mom admitted that she tried to control and manipulate Dad, just as he'd accused her of doing. Eventually, after a particularly explosive argument, Dad had stormed off to Atlanta for nearly 2 weeks. She hadn't known where he was until he'd returned, only to start taking out-of-town work assignments. Their separation had become inevitable. Mom revealed that the real breaking point had been when Mark brazenly approached their table, taking her for a dance without even asking permission. They danced through several songs before he told her to sneak out the back with him. When she returned to grab her purse, she'd met Dad's eyes. He'd seen everything, yet he quietly distracted him while she left. That night marked the beginning of the end of their marriage. It took another 1.5 years to finalize the divorce, but for Mom, the separation had been devastating. Reflecting on that time, Mom admitted that it wasn't the separation itself that haunted her most, but the reasons behind it. She confessed that, looking back, she likely would have destroyed her marriage even if Mark hadn't come along. She acknowledged a pattern of selfishness and entitlement that had plagued her relationships, and to her horror, she saw the same tendencies in me. She hoped that by sharing her story, she might save me from making the same mistake she had, offering it as a warning before it was too late. Mom described her marriage with Dad as deeply committed and strong. Dad had been a wonderful husband, but she'd allowed herself to be tempted by the thrill of attention from someone else, by Mark Levier, who'd flattered her and made her feel glamorous, offering her a brief escape from the life she had. She'd thought that after one night, she'd return to Dad, and that his love would somehow heal everything. But the damage was already done. I realized then that I'd fainted at some point, coming to with Mom handing me a glass of water and some cookies. She explained that I'd been unconscious for about half an hour. When I said I wanted to sleep, she doubted I'd be able to, given the weight of our conversation. She was right. The story she'd shared echoed too closely with my own thoughts. As we sat there, the clear bag holding her blue dress beside me, Mom expressed her fear that I'd follow in her footsteps, destined to ruin any marriage I entered. She wondered if I took Jackson for granted, if I was already on the path to seeking validation elsewhere, even though I hadn't physically crossed any lines yet. She encouraged me to listen to my conscience, warning that I'd risk dooming my marriage if I kept going this way. When I admitted feeling conflicted, Mom looked at me with a bittersweet smile. She said it was a good sign that I felt this turmoil, that I hadn't completely silenced the voice of reason. She confessed how skilled she'd once been at ignoring that voice herself, recognizing now how deeply she'd rationalized her own mistakes, even as a psychologist who should have known better. Mom continued, admitting how she had once convinced herself that entertaining attention from another man was harmless, focusing on the thrill and validation it provided. She cautioned me against assuming Jackson's forgiveness would be guaranteed, comparing that assumption to taking a risky medication that might lead to self-destruction. She emphasized the deeper impact this would have, not only on Jackson, but on Olivia, Max, Ben, herself, and even my father. She worried about 3 generations of women following the same destructive path, and the thought of disappointing my father weighed heavily on her. As Mom dug into our family's history, she clarified that my grandmother, Nana, who was from the Reed side of the family, had no known affairs. But she spoke about my great-grandmother, Carol, who had cheated on her husband James, Dad's father, while he was gravely ill. She had a relationship with a man named Ralph, eventually marrying him after James passed away, though that marriage ended due to mutual infidelity. Carol later married Bob, whom she'd met in a support group for families coping with illness. My dad had been so upset by her actions that he distanced himself from Carol for a long time, holding her partly responsible for James's death. Mom explained that I might not have known this part of the family history because my parents were already divorced by the time they'd reconnected with Carol and Bob. Dad had eventually forgiven Carol and even became friends with Bob, understanding he hadn't been responsible for what had happened. But it had taken him much longer to forgive Mom. He only found that forgiveness at my wedding, more than 20 years after their divorce, even though she felt she hadn't truly earned it. At the time, her apologies had felt shallow, more about mending her own reputation than anything else. She admitted she'd been proud of her affair back then, thinking her independence mattered more than any damage done. Mom confessed that she feared being single, having never truly experienced it, while Dad, after their divorce, had taken time for himself before getting involved again. She hadn't understood his need for that space back then. She admitted that she'd given Mark her number the very night they'd met, leading to calls and secret meetings. Before she knew it, she'd fallen into another relationship without considering the harm it might bring. 2 weeks later, on St. Patrick's Day, with her marriage to Dad already crumbling, she secretly met with Mark again, believing that her relationship with him didn't affect her marriage. What Jim didn't know wouldn't hurt him, she told herself. Looking back, she realized how foolish she'd been. She'd even staged a fake breakup with Mark, going as far as playing a recorded call to convince Dad it was over. But Mark stayed in her life until their divorce was finalized, eventually moving on to his next conquest. Mom explained that her story didn't end with Dad. After the divorce, she'd married Jeff, a good man, though she admitted he wasn't like Dad. She'd chosen Jeff largely because he was available and seemed to offer stability. While she might have been able to make things work with Jeff, she didn't invest in the marriage as she should have. She was devoted to raising Ben and me, but her commitment to Jeff as a husband remained shallow. She assumed that if Jeff really loved her, he would accept her choices, even if they meant taking a back seat to her other interests. After Jeff, she'd gotten involved with Danny, looking for a relationship that allowed her more freedom. Danny was fine with having other partners, essentially cheating on her, and she tolerated it as a sort of penance for her past choices. Though she didn't truly love Danny, they married and went on like this for several years. Eventually, she began feeling neglected and sought attention elsewhere, reasoning that if an open marriage worked for Danny, then it should work for her too. However, her arrangement with Danny fell apart when she became involved with Glenn. Mom sighed, confessing that Glenn, her last husband, was actually the best partner she'd had since Dad. She wanted me to understand how her repeated patterns had cost her deeply, and she worried I might be on the same path. Mom continued, describing how she'd always believed that Glenn would forgive her, no matter what she did. One of their biggest arguments happened after my wedding, when Mom had focused all her energy on reconciling with Dad for closure, barely acknowledging Glenn. It was Dad who had to point out that she was neglecting her own husband, treating Glenn with the same disregard she'd once shown to Dad, Jeff, and Danny. Mom broke down, openly weeping as she recounted this part of her story. I sat there, absorbing the emotional weight of her confession, my hands beginning to tremble. I barely made it to the bathroom before vomiting, overwhelmed by the revelations. Mom followed me, holding my hair as I retched, and tried to comfort me by sharing more about her mistakes, regrets, and the painful cycles she'd gone through. She described the broken marriages, selfish decisions, and the pattern of seeking escape from the commitments she'd made. She spoke about her weaknesses and acknowledged her self-centered choices. As I listened, I couldn't help but see parallels in my own life, shadows of choices I'd been on the edge of making myself. She spoke of wearing that blue dress to draw attention, taking her husbands for granted, and following a path of self-destruction. It was as if she were holding up a mirror, showing me the future consequences of my current actions. My head spun, weighed down by her words. The story of her life felt like an urgent warning, one I couldn't ignore. Mom admitted that she'd even married Glenn partly to shield him from the pain she'd inflicted on previous husbands. Trying to support her, I offered words of comfort, though I couldn't shake the realization that I was confronting my own reflection in her story. She urged me to consider the consequences of my choices, specifically how they would affect Jackson. The weight of truth, regret, and the need to make a decision overwhelmed me. I barely made it to the bathroom again, collapsing on the cold tile floor as the room spun, gripped by both physical nausea and emotional turmoil. My mother's story was like a tangled web of heartbreak and missteps, with echoes that seemed to resonate all too clearly in my own life. She stayed by my side as I struggled through my thoughts. She encouraged me to let all the bad stuff out, emphasizing how important it was to understand the consequences of tearing down one's own life over and over. She pleaded with me not to follow the same path she had, and as I sat there, I began questioning my own choices, berating myself for not listening to Jackson's warnings. I doubted whether I even deserved his love or the home we built with Olivia and Max, fearing I was bound to follow Mom's destructive pattern. After what felt like forever, Mom handed me some mouthwash and offered me ginger cookies to settle my stomach. She brushed my hair and let me change into sweats from her closet, since we wore the same size. Once I was comfortable, she bundled me into her car and drove me to Ben and Bernice's house a few miles away. She explained to my brother that I understood now, in a way I hadn't before, the impact of my actions. She reassured him she'd see him later in the morning when they could all share pancakes and a fresh start. As she left, Ben guided me inside, leading me to the spare room they'd set up as a nursery for their little girl. He promised he wouldn't lecture me, knowing that Mom had probably already done plenty of that. He hoped I could get some rest and process everything before dawn. Then he said he needed to share something important about Jackson. He revealed that, though he hadn't spoken to Jackson directly since I'd left, he wanted me to understand something about him I might not fully appreciate. In a quiet but intense tone, Ben explained that Jackson was a fighter, a former Olympic fencer who had gone on to work as a combat consultant and choreographer for movies and theater. Though Jackson made it all look flashy, Ben emphasized that Jackson knew how to handle a real fight and had a deep, unwavering commitment to protecting his family. Ben's words hit me hard. He described Jackson as a kind of warrior, someone who would go to great lengths to keep us safe and united, and that trying to deceive him would be futile. Ben's reminder made me realize that Jackson's love and awareness were deeper and more resilient than I'd given him credit for. I felt a surprising mix of gratitude and relief as Ben shared one final revelation. Our father had actually given Jackson a warning talk before our wedding. It was a traditional father-to-son-in-law conversation, but with a unique twist. Dad had candidly talked with Jackson about potential challenges he might face in being married to me, offering a perspective on our family's history and, ultimately, on human nature itself. Hearing that my family had made preparations, hoping to safeguard me from a destructive path, was both humbling and reassuring. Ben hugged me, kissing my forehead with a gentle brotherly protection that warmed me with a sense of security I hadn't felt in a long time. For the first time in days, I slept soundly, the weight of my emotions beginning to lift. The next morning, the usual family chaos greeted me. Kids scrambling, missing shoes, and rushed breakfasts with unbrushed teeth. In Ben's home, it all felt nostalgic, reminding me of the early, hectic days of parenting. I watched as Ben's wife, Bernice, moved through the morning routine, her calm and graceful presence balancing everything around her. Her soft Belgian accent added a touch of elegance, and it was clear that Ben's protective instincts extended fully to her, creating a haven of stability and security for their family. Breakfast that morning was special. The pancakes were more than a meal. They tasted like a fresh start, a moment of relief, and a renewed sense of hope. As we sat together, conversation turned away from past troubles and focused on small moments of joy and connection, allowing us all to reset. Later, Mom arrived, driving my car to meet us, and mentioned she'd put a little something in the back seat. When I looked, I saw it was her blue dress. She told me it was a symbolic gesture of letting go, of leaving the past behind. Although the style was outdated, she joked it might even come back in fashion someday, and with a slight shrug, she added, "Consider it vintage. You're an adult, a beautiful one. You'll make your own decisions, so do what you want with it. Just promise me one thing. Don't repeat my mistakes, and whatever you do, don't let your father see you wearing it. That would give him a heart attack." "I won't, Mom," I replied, deeply moved. "Thank you for everything." We hugged, exchanging "I love yous," and with one last wave, I prepared to start my drive home. But first, I knew I needed to send 2 messages. In the first, I contacted Richard, canceling my trip to Chicago. I instructed him to call off the plane tickets, the hotel, and my conference registration. I demanded a refund for the fees, making it clear he should find someone else for the presentation. I also told him how furious I was that he'd endangered my marriage and nearly wrecked my family, and I warned him to keep any communication strictly professional and as minimal as possible. I made it very clear that he should stay away from both Jackson and my brother, for his own safety, since they now knew everything. In the second message, I reached out to Jackson. I apologized, feeling the full weight of my choices and regretting the pain I'd caused him. I promised to be fully honest from now on, to never take him for granted, and to recognize just how much he meant to me. I thanked him for stepping in and reminded him of my love and commitment, understanding now the depth of our family's story and my own role in preserving it. I vowed to never repeat this kind of behavior, to guard our marriage and my role in it with all the respect he deserved. As I began my journey back, a thought crossed my mind about what to do with Mom's blue dress. I knew, without a doubt, that the best thing would be to destroy it, a final break from the painful echoes of the past.